Welcome back to the critique. So a key theme running through this material seems to be this really visceral rejection of a very popular children's YouTuber.
A very strong take.
A very strong take. It argues she's both a political propagandist and, maybe more to the point, a producer of just vapid, patronizing content. The author has a great word for it. Slop.
Yeah, that label really sticks.
It does. And look, this submission is powerful. The conviction is there, the language is designed to engage, it's very effective.
It absolutely is. You can feel the author's position from the very first line.
So because that passion is already there, we're going to focus on elevating the execution to really match that intensity. So let's just dive right in. Okay, our first area of focus is really about how the emotional core of this is being used. The essay does a fantastic job of establishing a critique based on, political alignment and just personal dislike.
The vibe check.
Exactly, the vibe check. The author's whole point is that they find this creator creepy, that parents need a radar for this kind of weird presentation. And the argument is that these vibe-based arguments really matter in parenting.
That's clearly laid out. I mean, that intuitive repulsion is maybe the essay's greatest initial strength. But I wonder, though, if we've considered the limitations of leaning so heavily on a gut feeling.
What do you mean?
Well, while that vibe check is super relatable, it risks just staying a personal judgment. It's not really transferable. The argument right now is basically, these are creepy, weird people.
Right? And it focuses a lot on the aesthetic. The adult in overalls, the sneakers, acting like a kindergartner.
Exactly. So what about the reader who doesn't immediately find that creepy? For them, the argument just sort of falls apart. The sense of danger beyond a personal ick factor just isn't there.
Okay, I see the problem. If the reader isn't on board with the initial aesthetic discomfort, the whole premise collapses. But if we shift the focus to, say, algorithmic exploitation, don't we risk losing that raw personal angle that makes it so powerful?
That's the balance, right? We have to honor that gut feeling. The suggestion here isn't to abandon it, but to reframe it.
Okay.
Reframe that subjective feeling of weirdness into a more sophisticated critique of commercial exploitation, of the whole monetization structure of kids' media. We're shifting from the creator's personal weirdness to their systemic function.
So that gives real objective weight to that great label the author uses, slot merchants for toddlers.
Exactly. It shows they figured out it's extremely profitable. We need to analyze the why behind the weirdness, not just say this is weird.
So you're saying we should use the creator's success against them, basically turn their high view count into the smoking gun.
Precisely. You make the aesthetic choices the evidence of the systemic problem. The author can analyze that presentation style, the high-pitched voice, the super enthusiastic speech, the kid clothes, not as personal quirks,
but as calculated choices.
Calculated choices required by the YouTube algorithm. The whole thing is designed for hyper-engagement.
So how do you prove that? How do you show its manufactured authenticity and not just, genuine, if a little irritating, educational intent?
Well, the author can show how this specific style is optimized for profit. They could, for instance, research how the platform prefers those exaggerated vocal tones, the rapid cuts. The argument becomes that they're sacrificing actual teaching quality for algorithmic compliance.
So the overwhelming niceness isn't benign? It's a tactic?
It's a calculated veneer. This allows the author to argue that the whole thing represents manufactured authenticity. It's an engineered persona meant to hook kids and bypass parents, not real educational content.
That's really powerful. It elevates the vibe check from "this person makes me uncomfortable" to a systemic warning against commercial manipulation. You're giving the reader a tool, not just an opinion.
Exactly. The personal ick factor becomes an objective red flag that any parent can learn to spot, whether they find overalls creepy or not.
Okay, let's move on to the second critique. This piece uses some incredibly passionate language, but we need to make sure that rhetoric isn't actually overshadowing the evidence. The repulsion to the content, this pure slop, it's compelling for sure, but the central claim that it's bad for their minds and their souls gets a little diminished because it's relying almost exclusively on, extreme hyperbole.
And it is extreme.
As I understand it from the notes, the argument is that the content is so awful that the author says things like, "I would rather be stabbed to death," or "I would rather jump out of the 100-story window."
Right. And then it's followed by the conclusion that it's all just vapid and irritating and stupid.
You can feel the frustration, and that sincerity is important. But is there a risk that focusing so much on that high-stakes emotional language might actually overlook the more precise critiques of developmental harm the author makes later?
How do you mean? The author uses strong words like patronizing and overstimulating. Aren't those specific?
They are, but those critical mechanisms of harm get buried. They get lost under the sheer intensity of the adult writer's personal annoyance. The hyperbole, "I'd rather be stabbed," it sort of overwhelms the reader's ability to focus on the serious claim about developmental damage.
So the critique itself is valid, but the delivery makes the reader focus on the author's reaction, not the content's flaw. That's the weakness.
Exactly. So what's the path forward?
The suggestion is to pivot from personal revulsion to establishing a standard of respect for the audience, which is a concept the author actually introduces but doesn't fully use.
Okay.
The goal has to be to define why it's patronizing and why it's overstimulating. The argument has to shift decisively from "I hate this" to "this methodology is developmentally unsound."
That's very actionable. So replace revulsion with rigorous analysis. What are some concrete ways the author can actually structure that pivot?
We need to analyze the content's educational approach and just move completely past the writer's inability to watch a 20-second clip. The critique needs to be built around specific, pedagogical deficits. Let's take the 2 points, patronizing and overstimulating.
Okay, start with patronizing. How do you prove that?
If the weakness is that it's patronizing, the author needs to show how the vocabulary, the sentence structure, the cadence of the speech is demonstrably less sophisticated than what a child in that target age can actually absorb.
It moves it beyond just a feeling.
Right. And then you can contrast that directly with someone like Mr. Rogers, who the author admires. Rogers used intentional pauses, complex vocabulary, a pacing that respected a child's mind. This creator, on the other hand, uses constant repetition, simple language, potentially stunting a child's growth by never challenging them.
So Mr. Rogers becomes a pedagogical standard, not just a cultural touchstone. The Slop fails against that standard.
Exactly. Now, for overstimulating, if that's the weakness, the author needs to highlight the frequency of the cuts, the visual and auditory shifts. That's the specific mechanism that turns kids into overstimulated dopamine addicts. Instead of just saying, "it's annoying," the argument becomes,
This content uses X cuts per minute and Y volume of high-pitched sound.
a rate specifically designed to hijack a child's attention. You're defining the harm by the mechanism. It links the content structure directly to cognitive damage. That is a much more devastating critique than just saying the host is personally irritating.
That's a sharp framework. Okay, let's move on to the third and final high-level critique. This is about how some key supporting arguments are just sort of treated as self-evident when they really need to be backed up.
Right, the political foundation of the argument.
Let's look closely at the section about that. The author claims the creator is on a propaganda tour with Mom Donnie to talk about universal childcare. And the author's position is that this is really bad for kids because it's the state's way of getting more kids into childcare and away from their parents.
Okay, that is a massive claim. And it's a vital part of the argument that this creator is, some kind of nefarious political force. But is the connection between that serious political charge and the content itself, is that connection fully established, or is that an area to really bolster?
It seems like it's not.
The claim is that the state wants kids spending even more time with government workers because government workers are the best. But then this huge point is immediately set aside. The author literally says, we don't even need to get into that, and then pivots back to the slop debate.
Which is surprising. If the author sees the creator as a propagandist, why drop the main piece of political evidence?
Exactly. By treating the idea that universal childcare is inherently bad as self-evident, and then just dropping it, the whole propaganda element feels really underdeveloped. The author identifies this creator as a political force, but doesn't actually take the time to deconstruct that force. It leaves like half the essay unsupported.
A major gap in the logic, then. If the intent is to expose this person as a political force, they have to integrate that charge, not just assume the reader agrees and move on.
Right. We need to treat the political claims with the same rigor we just talked about for the content quality. And I think there are two main ways to strengthen this section.
Okay, let's start with the first one, integration. How do you weave the politics back into the content critique?
Well, you detail how the seemingly neutral content, the ABCs, the colors, serves as a Trojan horse for the political ideology the author mentioned earlier, like the focus on LGBT pronouns.
Okay.
The author needs to show how the soft, harmless-looking content provides cover for a harder ideology. Why is this creator focusing on these specific elements in a way that just happens to align with the policies the author finds so dangerous?
So you connect the slop directly to the propaganda by showing the insidious nature of embedding ideology into what looks like basic learning.
Yes, because that's what makes it so effective. It bypasses parents who are just looking for innocent educational material. The manufactured authenticity we talked about before is designed to make it all look hyper-wholesome. The author can argue that the creator's real danger lies in making politically charged topics seem normal and palatable to young kids, all under the guise of learning colors.
That definitely closes the loop between the vibe check and the political charge. What about the second path, expansion?
If the goal is to highlight the danger of that specific childcare policy, then the author has to expand on the claim that kids should spend even more time with government workers. They can't just assert it.
Right.
They need to cite specific policy concerns, or historical precedents, or logical consequences to back up the conclusion that this system moves kids away from their parents.
So for example, instead of just saying the policy is bad, detail the philosophical framework they object to. Is it replacing parental teaching with a government curriculum? Is it the standardization of care? What is it?
Precisely. If the author believes this system undermines parental authority, they need to show the mechanisms of how the policy does that. That gives the political argument the teeth it really needs.
This has been a really insightful critique of a very passionate piece of writing. So to recap quickly, we've identified 3 main opportunities here, all really aimed at replacing that subjective feeling with more objective analysis.
First, transition that really effective subjective vibe check into a systemic critique of commercialized authenticity. Use the creator's style as evidence of algorithmic exploitation, not just personal taste.
Second, to really land the claim that the content is damaging, the author should swap out the extreme personal hyperbole for precise analytical evidence. Define the harm of slop through specific, measurable pedagogical failures.
And third, the author has to fully integrate and support that core political claim about universal childcare. Don't just dismiss it as self-evident. Either show how the content is a Trojan horse for ideology, or expand the policy critique with specific support.
So the key actionable suggestions are: structure the content critique around things you can actually measure, like cuts per minute or vocabulary level, and make sure every big assertion, political or emotional, is backed up with logic and evidence.
Yeah, this material is already so sharp and engaged. By applying these kinds of systemic revisions, I think the author can make sure the argument is not just passionate, but logically airtight and persuasive to a much wider audience.
We invite you to refine the material based on this feedback and submit your revised work for a follow-up critique soon.